My name is Anthony Pelican. I am Matthew's postdoc, and I'll be acting as the moderator today for the webinar.
I'm Matthew Berland. I'm a professor, I'm associate professor here physically at UW-Madison in Design, Informal, and Creative Education program, and the director of the UW Games program. My PhD is in learning sciences from Northwestern decade plus ago.
I'm Nathan Hulbert. Hello, everybody. I'm a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. I also received my PhD from Northwestern. Here at Teachers College, I'm in the Math, Science, and Technology department in a program called, it's a very long name, called Communication, Media, and Learning Technologies Design. As you might expect from my paper, and if we've had a chance to get to know one another, I'm interested in design. I'm interested in how design intersects with how people think and how people learn. And I'm excited to talk with you today about one of those studies that we did.
Hi, I'm Cynthia D'Angelo. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm in the College of Education in two departments, in educational psychology and curriculum and instruction, part of this new initiative here called Technology Innovations for Education, Research, and Design, called TIRED, which is very exciting. So it's my first year here. Before this, I was at SRI for about 6 years, doing lots of different kinds of education research. My background's in physics, and I did my early grad work in physics education research, and for my PhD, I worked with Doug Clark to develop Surge Classic, one of the teaching physics games. So I'll be talking about that a little bit later. I did a postdoc at UW-Madison as well, and I'm really excited to talk about this. So.
Great. Well, thanks again for the introduction, Tony, and thank you, Cynthia and Matthew, and everyone for joining us today to talk about this paper that I wrote with Uri Walensky, Designing Educational Video Games to be Objects to Think With. I'm going to give you hopefully a very brief and short overview of this paper. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details about the study and the results or anything like that, but I want to give you kind of a high-level overview of why we wrote the paper and what our goals were for this work. And then hopefully we'll have a nice, good conversation about the implications of this. And so please use the Twitter chat. Please use the email address that you were shared with, or the chat itself, to ask questions so we can have a nice conversation about this work. So we were in this paper really sort of trying to challenge some of the assumptions or some of the common practices of educational game design. Educational game design, like most design, I think educational design is often about creating experiences or obstacles or challenges with a goal towards teaching very specific content, skills, or practices. But games are a peculiar kind of a thing, right? Players don't always see game experiences as having some sort of meaning or value outside of the game experience. And, that's probably not a bad thing in many cases, right? So while the learning sciences has been pretty effective at creating games and other kinds of educational technology where learners encounter and deeply interact with concepts that we'd like them to learn, it's often true with games that those experiences and those ideas get stuck within the game itself. They don't see them as applicable outside of the game. And so our goal here in this work was to examine ways we could create games that encourage players to actually take their experiences, their prior knowledge, their intuitions, and apply them, intuitions and things that they've built through their own interactions in the world, and apply them into their experience and their interpretations of what's happening in the game itself. And furthermore, to ensure that they can take those experiences, those intuitions, and their experiences in the game and use those to experiment with and tinker with representations and practices that might have value outside of the game itself. In essence, this was really about kind of pushing the design debate beyond educational games that assume a somewhat standard endpoint where every player is encouraged to learn some sort of common or formally accepted definition or concept towards learner-centered game designs that actually allow them to have diverse experiences, diverse explorations, and hopefully to have those kinds of explorations that have some sort of meaning or value for things that they might encounter beyond just the things that we have in the game itself. This is really about, building games to be for inquiry rather than for answers. We see this as kind of a step towards creating games to be what Papert referred to as objects to think with. Of course, when he used the term object to think with, he was referring to the logo turtle. right? This thing that has all sorts of meaning and has all sorts of knowledge connected to professional practices and other types of serious domains. But it's also an artifact that learners or users can have some sort of personal identification with. They can feel a personal connection to. They can sort of put themselves inside of it, and they can sort of think with this object. And to this end, we proposed this constructible authentic representation design framework for thinking about how could you create games to be something like an object to think with. And this constructible authentic representation framework is about building games that have meaningful opportunities for learners to build something inside of a game that has value and meaning in that game itself, that the construction process itself uses primitives or pieces that have sort of concepts integrated into their use and in their meaning, and also that players would, as part of that construction process, they would be creating artifacts that have meaning and value, not just in the game, but also outside of the game as well. To test this, we created a game called Particles. And Particles is a platformer where, like most other platformers, the goal is to get your character from one point in the level to another point in the level. But it's different in that the player actually has an opportunity to kind of redesign the game level as they play through it. And they do this by adding and removing bonds between atoms in this kind of atomizer construction space to create different types of molecular structures. Once they've built these molecular structures, players can actually add blocks into the game world that are made up of a great many number of those molecules that they've just designed. And then the blocks that they add to the game world actually have properties that are emergent from the interactions of many of these player design molecules. And so in that way, gameplay itself isn't just about running from one point in the level to the other. It's about kind of tinkering and experimenting with molecular level structures to create different types of blocks that could have properties that will help the player to reach their goal that they have in the game. By the way, the URL is there at the top. Feel free to check it out. It's a little bit different than the one you're seeing here because we have to continue to do some work on it. But of course, your feedback is always welcome. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details about the study, but I want to just tell you that we did conduct a study of this game. We, in particular, were trying to understand how players interacted in the game space, how they made sense of the representations and the game experiences, and also how those interactions might have become part of their thinking process beyond the game. So we conducted some semi-structured cognitive clinical interviews before and after playing the game and took a lot of extensive field notes and screen recordings of their gameplay. And we found a couple, I think, interesting things. One was that players actually used their intuitions about real-world objects to explore and experiment with molecular structures in this building space that we call the atomizer. They took their ideas about shapes, they took their ideas about objects and why they think objects might have certain properties to think about what kinds of shapes they might want to create or draw within the atomizer. And they engaged in this experimentation through not just the atomizer, but also through the level and the way in which the level kind of encouraged them to try new things. After playing the game, players tended to provide much more nuanced and complex explanations of why materials have properties that they have. And real materials, so like Lego blocks, they would tell us, instead of saying, I think Legos are hard because they have hard elements in them, they would say more complex things relating to the bonds and the molecular structures that might make up these objects. And they frequently referenced the game when they did that. Sometimes they did this explicitly, and sometimes they just would create explanations or actually create drawings that would reference back to some of the representations they had encountered and used in the game space. Again, suggesting that their experiences in this place became a set of kind of representations and tools that they could use to think through problems that were not just relevant to the game itself, but also to things outside of the game.
I really enjoyed reading your paper, and it made me mostly think about my dissertation work a while ago. So I was really thinking a lot about, like how Doug Clark has kind of positioned this disciplinary integrated games kind of framework and the newer versions of Surge and how those are different in a lot of ways from the original version. And I was thinking back to sort of why we initially had created the original Surge Classic game, called Classic now, before it was just Surge. And kind of thinking about a lot of the design kind of ideas we were thinking about with that original version and how I think it's very similar to kind of what you're talking about here as an object to think with. And how, we kind of had like the later versions of it kind of have gone in other directions, which I think are good in other ways, but really kind of reflecting on kind of the original design and why we kind of made things the way we did initially. So for people who don't know, the original kind of Surge version, basically, the idea was that, trying to teach Newtonian mechanics kind of things, a lot of concepts around understanding velocity, acceleration, force, those kinds of things. Students have a lot of trouble with that because our everyday life experiences, we don't ever have experiences without gravity or friction. And so people coming into these classes are not able to reason very well about those kinds of situations, like what would happen to objects in these different kinds of environments. And so the original idea was to give students basically an environment where they could play around and see how objects would move differently with no gravity or with no friction. And so the game, you know, it was basically like you had a little rocket ship kind of thing, and you could apply forces to it in different ways to kind of navigate around these different levels and get to the end. And those levels were designed very carefully, I'd like to think, to help kind of make sure that students got a lot of the different kind of key concepts and building kind of on each other over time to really understand all the different kinds of scenarios and situations that you would want to have to be able to sort of reason really well about these different kinds of environments with no friction, with no gravity, etc. So that later on, when you were taking your regular kind of, you know, test or more formal representations, more formal kinds of physics questions, you would have this kind of experience to draw from that you wouldn't normally have in order to kind of solve those problems. And, you know, it was really interesting. I was thinking back to this work. It was a while ago, but, you know, I think one of the reasons that Doug and the team kind of after I graduated moved to other things was because we did a lot of these experiments with the game in middle school, and because that was the original kind of audience we were thinking of, and it didn't work super well with that audience. I think so then they were trying to like, let's build more formal ways to kind of have representations in the game and things like that so that they kind of scaffolded a bit more and kind of think about it that way. But my dissertation study actually was undergrad students, and so it was a little bit different. And I was remembering back because a lot of I interviewed a few students, they did it as part of like a homework assignment basically in their class, so the intro-level physics class. And I interviewed students afterwards, and a lot of them said, you know, that the game really helped them, that they thought about the game when they were taking their midterm later, and that they were able to kind of think about like these scenarios when they were trying to solve these regular problems, which was really great to hear. I hadn't really expected that to be the case. We were hoping things, you know, it would kind of translate to kind of different kind of learning gains, but like I hadn't really expected them to actually kind of spontaneously tell us like, oh yeah, we were actually using this experience to like reason from when we were taking our midterm later. And so like that kind of a thing to me seems very much in line with like what this object to think with is. And so just kind of thinking about different ways to kind of build representations. And I guess some of the questions maybe we have for discussion later around kind of like, what does this building have to be? Does it have to be a physical kind of thing that students are building the game, or can it be more of a conceptual model that they're building in their minds maybe? And how do we think about that differently? In the Surge game, there was a lot of vector representations that we had in there that kind of helped them kind of make that bridge between the game world and the more formal representations in their class. But like how much of that is necessary, and like they weren't able to sort of build their own vector representations necessarily. So I wonder how much that kind of plays a role as well. So I'll stop there, but just kind of, those are my general comments. I'm really excited to talk more about this.
I want to just quickly add, you know, I thank so much for all of that. Doug and Cynthia as well, you know, I talked to them quite a lot during this work, both in the original game that started some of this work was a racing game. So it was actually dealing with some of the same concepts that you were just talking about, right? And so we've had many conversations about how this work is complementary to one another and where it's different and where it's similar. And so, you know, I think that's a super fun conversation to have that maybe we'll get into later.
First of all, I do also love this paper. I think I use this paper. I actually was writing a talk the other day and found I had already cited this paper in the talk. When I was going back to add it to the talk, I was like, oh, all right, it's already there. I think one of the reasons that I use, this is not just sort of like, let's make Nathan feel great time, although obviously that would be a great use of our time, just make him feel good. But I do think it's important to sort of focus on what the value of the paper is. And I think it's a little different for the three of us. For me, I think of it as a generative, applicable framework, meaningful construction, conceptually integrated primitives, and authentic representations. I already believed that those things need to go. I think that they're actually pretty crucial. I don't mean to say that there's nothing new here, but I think that by highlighting them, I mean, these are sort of core parts to I think a lot of good constructions design. But I think the key for this is highlighting them as the features that maybe are lacking in a lot of educational games, and also as, for me, an object or a framework I can then apply to things that already exist in a way to see, not a rubric exactly, but a way to see where I think that we've done, or I've done a better work of creating a learning environment, and what decisions I made, and make sure those decisions are conscious and intentional. So if I feel like the constructions are not particularly meaningful, one of the things that Nathan has done in this paper, which I think is brave but ill-advised broadly, is to use the words meaningful and authentic as 2 of his 7 words. That is, to my mind, absolutely insane, because those words are extraordinarily loaded and mean different things to literally everybody. But for me, meaningful construction means personally meaningful construction in this sort of classically Papert sense, or collectively or socially meaningful construction. And in the paper, I think Nathan means both of those things, and says he means both of those things. It's not even implicit. That's pretty clear. But when I look at CAR, and when I talk about how we build meaningful games, I like to highlight the sort of teasing out and to sort of tease out what we mean by meaningful when we talk about meaningful construction, and the value of that, right? Feeling like you are not just taking part in an experience. It's not like watching TV. And I think a lot of bad games, or not particularly educational games, are closer to watching TV than they are to really meaningful personal events. And also, exceptionally integrated primitives, we could talk about that. I'm going to set that one aside, although I actually don't know what conceptually integrated means. So that's, if anything, but we'll come back to that. And then authentic representation, again, you do this in the paper, and I really appreciate this. The Schaefer and Resnick paper I use all the time in my classes about what we mean by authenticity, where it's a personal, professional, real world, the four or 5 different aspects of authenticity. And you tease that out a little bit in your paper, where you talk about how they should be authentic to the target domain, but they also should be personally authentic. And again, I think focusing on these 3 things, not just as a way to build games, but as a way to see what's missing in game experiences that groups are having. That said, one of the funny things about using it as an object to think with is that I agree, good games, especially good educational games, have to be objects to think with. But on the other hand, I think I keep thinking back to Gears. I mean, obviously transformative, obviously where the idea comes from. That's the first part of the book Mindstorms by Seymour Papert. That's where this idea comes from. And think about all the ways that Gears do not satisfy almost any of the constraints that people have put on objects to think with in the last 40 years. Now, I am not someone who says every single word that Seymour says is inviolable, and that was the right idea, and we got it, we nailed it in 1980, and then what have we all been doing since? But on the other hand, I think about the value of the gear as an authentic representation. It is extremely useful, and use it all the time, and understanding a little bit about gears will help you in lots of different things that you try to build in your life, especially non-computational things, if you're trying to build a machine of some kind. And my child built a little mini golf course the other day and used something akin to a gear in it. And I was like, wow, look at that. He's like, well, you got to get the golf ball out of the little cardboard box you've hit it into. But thinking about the ways that we see gears everywhere, they connect to meaning explicitly outside of school, right? And the way that they're authentic, like personally and socially authentic representations that actually connect you to non-school ideas. Part of what I've thought about when I've been reading this paper is the degree to which something that looks like Super Mario Brothers does or doesn't do that. And so I guess the thing that I want to raise, and more importantly, sorry, for whom? right? And I'm definitely not saying that only like white boys play Super Mario Brothers. To be honest, I don't think anyone under 40 plays Super Mario Brothers, so I think it's semi-irrelevant. But again, the ways that those sort of platforming tropes are things that do sort of satisfy that Gears angle on objects to think with, and the ways that they don't, I think, and then there's something interesting there.
My super fast response to that is, number one, you're wrong. My kids play Mario all the time, including the original one. So let's start by saying Matthew's wrong. But then let me also agree with Matthew that I think, one of the conversations we had, I had with reviewers was whether or not this game and the kind of ideas proposed really rise to the level of objects to think with in the way in which it was initially proposed. And, one of the ways in which I try to kind of deal with that in the paper here is by saying that's sort of a goalpost. That's sort of the way, the direction we want to be moving towards. And that's sort of the thing we want to be kind of keeping our eyes on. And, CAR is sort of a way to maybe move in that direction, though I think it's certainly debatable whether or not it actually reaches that space. So that's my quick response.
I was just going to say, like, I think what this brings up a tension for me between sort of having objects that are good objects to think with, like Gears, for instance, versus trying to design environments that are going to be beneficial for learning for maybe specific kinds of learning goals. And I think that's maybe what this whole conversation is about in some ways.
And to add to that, and this is one of the things, again, that kind of kept coming up in my conversations with Doug, was in the specific intent of this game was to build a game that would be playable, would not be a classroom experience. It would be an experience the kid might have outside of a classroom. And the kinds of choices, design choices that you encounter whenever you're designing for an informal space look a little different than those that you might design that for a game to be played in a classroom. And I say that not in the sense that one is easier or better or worse, but that the kinds of representations you can use, the kinds of other external experiences you can use to try to help make those connections across spaces sort of has to look a little bit different. And it's an interesting challenge.
We've kind of already started, but we can move into the panel discussion. How about I throw out a question just to get you guys kind of talking? So how would you say the CAR framework and also the broader goal of creating games as objects to think with aligns with other educational game design frameworks, sort of like what are its strengths and weaknesses, and what kinds of games, concepts, and practices might be best for, and maybe what does it not do so well? What are its blind spots?
And we've mentioned Doug Clark and his team and Cynthia and many others that worked on Surge, and Surge kind of features prominently in the paper as well, because as I said, it was a game that I was thinking a lot about and having conversations about as I was designing it. And in particular, as this work went through many iterations, the disciplinary integrated practices, right? Yep. Games, disciplinary integrated games. Dig, not dip. Kind of emerged, and Doug and I had a few conversations about whether or not this idea was different, or how it was different, or how it was similar to CAR. And I think that it was such a fun debate and conversation to have about what is going on here. Are we just talking about the same thing using different names? Are we talking about different things? And one thing that I think we landed on that we agreed was that in disciplinary integrated games, and I don't want to give you the full explanation for what this is, but players also interact with representations, but they are kind of the way in which they interact with them is somewhat constrained. They are kind of intentionally being asked to use these representations in a somewhat standard way, and levels are structured in a way that sort of always encourage players to use them in a roughly similar way across all players. And in the CAR design, it's very intentional that players can design whatever they want to design, and that in fact they might design something that's not at all standard and may work or may not work, but that's okay, and that's sort of part of the design goal here. And there's plenty of, I think, conversation to be had about what are the various affordances of each of those paths. I argue that one of the values of the CAR angle, where players build something that they care about, is because they have a more personal sort of investment in what they've built. As Matthew said, they're not just kind of along for the ride. They feel like they're creating the experience. They feel like they've made a thing that has some sort of meaning to them. Or sometimes they make a thing and then they have to figure out how to apply meaning to it later, right? They made a thing, they're not quite sure why it worked, and now they have to try to figure out why it worked because they have to make another similar kinds of a thing. And so I think that that uncertainty, but also that sort of personal relationship with the artifact that they've created is kind of an interesting piece that I think has some different value than having them kind of construct representations in a more standard way. So I'll just mention that one, and then others can jump in.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference for me between the two. Most of the notes I made were about kind of artifacts and like, what kinds of artifacts would you build in the game about this topic? Or like, how is the different domains going to make a difference? And like, what kinds of representations might be available for students to create? And like, what's the design space maybe available to them in different kinds of domains? And like, how that might impact whether or not this kind of CAR framework would work well for certain kinds of games and certain kinds of educational context. I do think the formal versus informal environments plays a role as well, just because there's, usually a lot more constraints in classroom kinds of settings. And, like Surge was designed for classroom settings. And so I think a lot of the choices we made about, having students not really have the availability to create representations and things was partly because we were trying to, it's already at the point, it was like hard enough to convince teachers to like let them play games in the classrooms at all. I mean, this was like, a decade ago, and let that happen, period. And so like, if you're going to allow students to create their own representations, like that's going to take more time, right? And I think, trying to convince them to let us have this amount of time anyways, just to sort of figure out these concepts, let alone the representations of those concepts, was sort of a challenge, I think, in the beginning. So, I think that for classroom context, trying to do more of this, like students having their own kind of personal representations of things, like that's a good thing, but it's going to create, it's going to take more time to do that. It's going to be more work for the teacher to then, later try to get class consensus around different kinds of representations and kind of build towards a more normative model of those kinds of things. And so I agree that that is a very worthwhile thing to do. And I teach science methods for elementary teachers and things like that, and we definitely want them to do those kinds of things. But of course, knowing that like those things are really challenging for teachers to do and takes a lot of classroom time that they don't always have. So I guess, yeah, so that's sort of my kind of take on that. I think there's always design trade-offs whenever you're trying to create these kinds of things. And so when I think mostly about classroom settings, like we choose not to do those a lot of times because of those constraints, not because it's not as good for learning necessarily, which sucks, but that's kind of the reality of some of those things.
So I'm reminded of a paper. It's a JLS paper, a relatively recent one called Invented Science, where the authors talk about the ways that it's important to enable kids to see the value in the representations they create, and the sort of implications for both learning and for equity in turning it around and saying, instead of saying these are the valid representations, you have to get there, which is, again, as we know from learning sciences, from the history of learning sciences, and there's a bunch of learning scientists in the audience who can debate me, but when we just try and get people to an exact representation that we've already decided is the right one, it robs them all sorts of agency, and it sort of inhibits a deeper learning. Again, this is disciplinarily specific, but there are many arguments that sort of getting people to converge on math representations before they understand the underlying concepts is potentially problematic. So that was one thing that I thought. But I think again comes back to disciplinary specificity and disciplinary what the different disciplines value, right? So my content domain is computer science, which is a bit cheating for this in some sense, because there aren't a lot of formal, agreed upon disciplinary representations that we need everybody to come to sort of memorize in concert. Now, obviously, there are programming languages that we want them to know for this test or that test or whatever the situation is. But in general, one of the things that computer science values is this sort of inherent creativity that's a strong statement. But you have to tinker and create representations on your own in order to succeed in computer science. Is generally accepted by learning scientists who overlap into computer science. And I think that's, that comes to play here, and it comes to play in the ways that we use games, right? Because a lot of the games frameworks, a lot of the other educational game design frameworks are meant to bring people to common formal representations of math or of science that we expect them to know in order to pass the regents or whatever. And they have to be able to recognize this formula. And so those don't map well to the domains that I work in. And so I tend to, I tend not to use them very well, but obviously Doug's and this framework, Dig and Car tend to map more cleanly. We do have a question from the audience I'm noticing.
So this is from Matt Wu. With the design principles that you guys have discussed, can you comment on what you recommend, or what recommended teaching practices are that can facilitate sense making in a design space like this?
I would say I'm gonna actually punt to the panel first, because one of the design choices that I was making here very intentionally was to try to build a thing like this that could exist outside of a classroom space. And so this design is very intentionally not a thing that you're supposed to use in a classroom or teach to. Now, people do, that's fine. I don't have any beef with that. But the design is very much like, hey, how would a kid explore and make sense of material properties and the particulate nature of matter when they're playing a game at home because they want to play a game, right? What would that look like? What would a design need to look like to do that? And so, sort of intentionally not dealing with teaching practice. I have thoughts on this question, but I want to pitch it to my two expert panelists here who actually have thought a lot more about what it might look like to do this kind of a thing in a classroom, or at least one of my expert panelists, Cynthia.
I've thought a lot about this, actually. I think one of the things that I kind of focus on now is thinking about how to translate these kinds of learning technologies into regular classroom spaces, and how do we support teachers mostly in making that kind of transition happen from more of a lab setting or informal at-home setting to something that can be used in a formal classroom. And like I said, Surge was initially developed for formal classroom spaces. And so we had to think a lot about how to design the game so it could be used that way. And I think this is actually one of the things I talk to a lot of people about is this is sort of the thing that's really difficult to do in terms of designing games for these kinds of formal spaces. And you have to make a lot of choices about, and I think this is true actually generally with a lot of learning technologies, how much of this sort of structure, scaffolding, support happens within the game and how much of it happens outside of the game. And I think most people tend to put more of it in the game, which I think is usually a mistake. I feel like that people maybe don't trust teachers enough to do certain kinds of activities around the game, outside of the game, to help support students with their sense making. And so I would say for us, especially with Surge and other kinds of things we worked on in this space, a lot of times we try to let the game kind of exist in its own space. Students can spend their time kind of exploring different concepts in there, use them, and trying to build in, in our case, we had built in specific representations. And then for my dissertation study, actually, what I was trying to do is bridge that gap. So we had some kind of scaffolding questions after the game that were kind of meant to help bridge that gap into the classroom space where they had to use these things more formally as representations. But I think generally what you would want to do is if you're doing particles, for instance, right, the teacher can then the students have all created their own kind of representations of these different kinds of blocks, different kinds of materials. They have some idea of what those things are. And then for a lot of science education, discussion is usually the best way to kind of get those ideas visible to the rest of the classroom. This teacher can kind of organize discussions around, what are the different ones? How are these different models and different ideas similar to each other? Try to draw out similarities and differences across those different models that students have created. And then, over time through discussion, try to get students to a more, normative model of those different things. That is not an easy thing to do. And so this is why this is a really challenging thing, but that's the type of thing that we would want teachers to do with any kind of different thing that's going on. So it's not specific to games necessarily, but I think this game is good because it kind of allows students to have the time and space to create these different kinds of models that then they can discuss with their classmates?
My answer to the question is a classic, literally the academic answer to that question, which is it depends. And I think the answer is, in my opinion, radically different depending on what you're teaching, who you're teaching, where you're teaching, why you're teaching, right? I mean, these are all, I don't mean why in the sense of why would you decide to be a teacher, but sort of like what are the goals of this class, right? If they're seniors trying to prep for the AP, it's a very different question than if we're talking second graders, right? Like, I mean, in fact, I think teaching practices, I've taught in middle school on up. I've never taught elementary. On up all the way to graduate school from middle school. It's hard to even think of teaching practices that carry over from the 6th grade to graduate school. Besides respect everybody, care about them, support them, besides like general platitudes, it's hard to imagine what would be similar. But again, my expertise is not in teaching and teachers. But I do tend to lean on the authors of invented science who are upstairs from me, and any number of other other number of authors who I think are trying to find spaces to enable authentic, creative representations in their classes.
This is coming from Wick Perry. He asks, they ask, getting a game to be played at home seems to come with a lot of constraints itself. Being for attention with entertainment games. Do you think that there's anything about being an object for learning that would give it a leg up?
You know, this was again an intentional choice on my part when we thought about the design of this game. It is often the case that if you look at the research on educational games, quite a lot of it is we built a game, we put it in a classroom. And you know, I don't have any problem with that per se, but I think games kind of have, as I said before, they're sort of this kind of peculiar thing, and they have all sorts of culture around them. They have all sorts of assumptions. They have all sorts of kind of social capital around them. And one of the reasons in which people became interested in games as this educational tool is they thought, wow, look at how interested and how connected and how much time kids spend with these game artifacts. Wouldn't it be great if, and then all these things happen after that, right? And I think that in some ways has been a big mistake on our part. I think we sort of take the things we like about games, we try to extract it and then cram it in a classroom which there's a different culture, there's sort of a different set of expectations. And I think a lot of what is interesting about games doesn't actually come to fruition in that different space. It's not to say that it couldn't, but that when we sort of do this pick it up and move it over here, it doesn't often do that. So I was really trying to say, let's stay in that space. Let's stay in that context in which kids encounter games. And let's see what we could do in that space. What kinds of things could young people learn, or could young people think about if they were encountering a game in that space? And Particles wasn't, let's build the game that's going to be the one. It was, let's build a game that could give us a space to test and play with these design ideas, right? So all that to say, I think there's some interesting take-home messages that we got from this, right? So if you have a very good measure of whether or not somebody's having fun, I'd love to see it. I've seen a couple different ones and they're all kind of weak. But I can say, you know, that every single player said they really enjoyed the game. And I can say that every single player, I'll say every single player but one was, you know, super into the game, engrossed in the game, and continued to play the game and until I told them they needed to stop. One player, we're actually, a lot of these players, as I mentioned in the article, we recruited from a gaming club. And one player, she was playing the game and she was like, can I just go back and play Minecraft? I was having a lot of fun doing that. I'd rather do that than this. I'm like, you know what? Fair point. We can be done. So we did have some evidence that people liked the game. For me, what's interesting though is, could that game experience still feel like a fun, authentic game experience while also giving you space to kind of wrestle with and tinker with and think about ideas that might have value beyond the game space? And I think the games show that there is some evidence that did happen. But I'll pass it off now to Matthew to do some commenting.
I feel like I've got a lot of thoughts on this. I highlight a couple. One is, I think in anything there's sort of the opposite problem. I don't think there's a million games out there. I'm definitely not saying that that any game that any of us are going to build is going to be a trillion seller Fortnite competitor. But I think on the other hand, there's lots of spaces that aren't school, like home with parents and libraries and community centers and after school clubs and school itself. Even if you don't build it for schools, there's so many different places where people have a real hunger for pro-social experiences, where people have a real hunger for things that they have some sense of how they might be used meaningfully. My experience, we've built several games, one of which was with Professor Holbert, but in my lab, we've built many games, and very rarely is the problem getting people to play. Very much more, it's getting interesting data because we're researchers and valid, good data. But I don't know if this is known to the panel. It's generally sort of a function of any number of other things. But basically, every single student in middle and high school has played a game in the last month. And I don't mean, there is no demographic category of which that's not true. It was, I believe, 98% in the last Pew study, and the 2% were skewed extremely wealthy. So those are not homeless kids. Those are kids who go to Andover and Exeter, whose parents are like, no games for you, you have to cram. But, right, like it wasn't that, so everybody who doesn't go to Andover has played games in the last, effectively within a margin of error, has played games recently. Now, what the space of those games are and the way that you get that data and what games they have access to is a real question. But as we build more of these games, creating spaces for people to play with their families and talk about stuff with their families and create things for people to play in museums and libraries. And again, these things can be used in school. They're just not built as part of a curriculum. But I, as a teacher, used a lot of games that were not built to be part of my curriculum. And I think that's true of many teachers in many schools across many different sort of types of schools and different types of classrooms across the United States.
This one comes in from Michael Swart. They ask, in your case study, you present count data of 4 conceptual codes, kind, structure, bond, and spacing, highlighting that pre-interview, students focus more on identity, but post-interview discussing structure and bonds. This seems logical after exposure to the game. However, in analyzing pre to post, it seems like pre-interview drawings do indicate structure and bond in lieu of their ability to verbalize these features. Is it the author's contention that particles is an object to think with that helps formalize understandings? And will there be future quantifiable research examining whether students' understandings increase from playing the game, and that those understandings transfer into demonstrable learning in formal domains of chemistry and physics?
A couple things to say. One, I think you're correct in sort of the way in which you talk about the pre-interviews, that there is some evidence that there is some idea of bonding, for example. It's worth mentioning that the way, and for those of you who have done semi-structured cognitive clinical interviews, one kind of feature of these is that the way in which questions are asked, the way in which tasks are presented, what the interviewee thinks the task is about, or what the interviewee thinks the knowledge that would be relevant to the question that's being asked is, all impact how they'll respond, or rather, what I should say is it impacts sort of the knowledge that gets sort of coalesced in that particular moment, right? So this is, and I say in the paper, we sort of drawing from a knowledge in pieces framework, where knowledge is kind of comes together as we try to propose explanations, or we try to sort of engage in some sort of thinking process. And so yes, whenever I don't have the actual objects in front of me right now, but I do have a Lego. We would say things like, okay, can you talk to me about the properties of this object? Can you talk to me about, what are the properties? Just describe them. Then we'd ask them to do things like talk about why they think has those properties. And eventually, as I describe all these methods in the paper more clearly, but I'd ask him to, I'd sort of propose the idea of an atom, or propose the idea of a molecule if they hadn't yet brought up the idea on their own, and ask them to now start talking about what they think the atoms might be in this object. And when we did that, students tend to talk in the pre-interview in this very kind of abstract, not very clear way. They'd be like, well, I think they're probably small, they're circles, probably, I think like the block. They're probably hard. Maybe they're metals. They would talk about these kind of these sort of abstract ideas. Now, whenever I would ask them to draw the molecules in the pre-interview, you'd start to see a variety of kind of interesting things happen, right? Sometimes they would, a very common thing that happened that shows up in the codes a little bit is they would draw the water molecule. Like everyone knows what the water molecule is supposed to look like. They would even say things like, oh, it's like a Mickey Mouse. You know, they would use the language that was very common in classrooms. And so this activity of drawing an atom or drawing a molecule became very much a formal exercise. I'm supposed to report to you now what I know my science teacher wants me to report, right? And so just things like bonding and stuff does tend to show up in there. But their explanations don't. Now, after playing the game, we saw a shift where these two things actually sort of started to look a little more similar, where they would talk about kind of structures, they'd talk about bonding, they talk about spacing in the interview. And then also when they would do the drawing, they would do that as well. But they would also oftentimes in their drawings create structures that, as I show, I think with one of the participants in particular, that they would use to continue to do additional reasoning. They would say things like, well, you know, this is the structure I think it is, but I don't understand why this would be bouncy. And, you know, the interviewer would say, well, can you think about, you know, what if there was lots of these, or what if this was bigger than you thought it, than this particular drawing you had? And then they would be able to kind of expand upon that to come up with some explanation that satisfied them. And so I think, you know, the proposal here isn't that it's necessarily all formalized, that the particle sort of solves all the problems and formalizes it, but it creates, it provides a knowledge resource where the player is able, or the learner is able to actually kind of use these representations, use these experiences to become part of the collection of resources that they draw on when they try to provide these explanations. It's not the only resource they draw on. In fact, they draw on a lot of other resources as well still, but it becomes part of the collection of resources that become relevant here. And I think that's what, of course, the goal and the effort was there.
I mean, one of the thoughts that I had is, I think it depends on what understanding means to you, right? And I have a internal definition for understanding, but I think it has something to do with the way that these things manifest socially, the way that these things manifest cognitively, and the way that these things manifest technically is generally the way I sort of break that down. And after Andy Bessesa's work, again, knowledge in pieces related, and I think that, again, I have trouble understanding what conceptually integrated primitives means. I don't think I believe in that idea, but I believe in it as much as I believe anything, I guess. But I think to the degree to which that is a coherent idea, it relates to the nature of syntonicity, as Tappert called it, or to the embodied nature of science, as Mitch calls it. The ways that we as people in the world and where we come from and who we are and how our bodies are and how our the relationship of us to our existence is represented in a connected way, in a fundamentally connected way, both to the game itself and to the understandings that might be fostered or supported by the object to think with. And that's the way I see that contributing, is sort of like, this is an interesting way, by focusing on these things, it might surface or foreground aspects in which these ideas become conceptually integrated, or what conceptual integration might mean vis-a-vis the relationship between embodiment, syntonicity, and what Michael is calling formalized understandings. I don't know that I believe in demonstrable learning besides sort of doing more things, but that's a separate issue.
I guess I'm just thinking about Surge again, and physics, and like this issue about, you know, part of the problem is not so much that, like, you know, like if we're thinking about this resources kind of perspective too, students have lots of good kind of intuitions about things, but they don't have good experiences with these other kinds of, you know, frictionless, you know, no gravity environments, and they're not able to reason with it. And then the game, I feel like, in some ways gives them some kind of, not a full embodiment, because it was happening on a screen and stuff, and they were just kind of using arrow keys, but it was kind of helping them kind of think about how things might move in their environment if these other constraints were not there. And I feel like that's kind of getting closer to that embodiment a little bit, that those kind of maybe like an embodied kind of primitive or embodied resource or something that's helping them kind of think about like how these different things would move in a different environment, how if that was reality, like giving them some kind of experience to kind of draw from when they're then trying to reason about these other more formal problems in that space. I don't know if that's exactly what Mitch is asking, but like, it seems to me like there is something there. I'm not really sure how you can necessarily design specifically for that, because I do think it's dependent a lot on the specific domain and the context and like what you're trying to really get students to understand. Like some concepts have a much closer relationship to different kinds of embodiments than others. So yeah, I don't know if there's some kind of overall design thing, but I think anytime that you can design to sort of incorporate more of this embodiment kind of aspect to it, that's usually a good thing.
I can say that, just a real quick final note on that. The game that I built that first kind of helped me think about what this car principle was a game called Formula T Racing, and it was, again, this physics game, right, where I was wanting students to play with the relationship between acceleration and velocity, and as Cynthia just said, I mean, those are ideas that you can sort of feel, that you can have this kind of embodied interaction experience with, and so it felt like a low bar that I could kind of jump right into. And I also was thinking of things like Mario Kart. I mean, kids have all these sort of embodied, that you can visibly see while they play, way of thinking about and feeling acceleration and velocity. So one little quick point for this was I did come up with kind of a design that I thought was really relevant here, that I also think is connected to car. And that is that players, in the first part of the game, they play the game using a Wiimote. So they would actually roll it forward to go faster and roll it back to go slow. And so there was this sort of embodied, actual, fully embodied sense of motion and speeding up and slowing down. And as the game progressed, they were encouraged to construct velocity versus time graphs. And to construct them, they had to use the same Wiimotes. They would press a button to create a point, and then they'd accelerate the point up the graph or decelerate the point down the graph. And they would do this to construct a full kind of graph of what they wanted the race, how they wanted the car to drive around a track. And that was my sort of best effort to sort of try to connect this idea of how do we use players' sort of embodied sense of acceleration. How do we use the representation of a graph? We also had other representations of colors as they changed as people raced, to try to connect all these different representations together. And I think it was pretty interesting. You can check it out there's a 2014 paper that Uri and I wrote that's cited in the JLS paper that has this in there. For particles, it was a little different, right? I think there is an embodied component here. I think players do think a lot about how things feel and how they would react. One of my interview questions was, if this floor was bouncy, what would that look like? What would that feel like? What do you think it would be made of? And so trying to get players to think about themselves as the player in the game jumping on these things, right? But I'm not sure, but I would say for sure in the design of particles, I leaned a lot less on this notion of embodiment in the design, and it was staying in a little bit more of a cognitive space for that. But there's lots of possible implications. And also, what about a more social cultural angle on this? What would that look like? Would car still be relevant for that? I think is a worthwhile question. But that's for the next panel, I believe.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I think we're just about at time. So I want to thank Nathan, Cynthia, and Matthew for your great discussion, and also for the attendees for the wonderful questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thank you, Cynthia,
for coming.
Matthew, Tony, Lillian. Thank you for organizing.